Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of our 15-week MCAT supplement course. We previously did a 15-week MCAT course live that covered the highest yield content from the MCAT. You can find all of those on any of our channels as well, and we are now on week 2 of the supplement course, which is just filling in some of the information gaps of some important information that's going to be on the MCAT for you. So my name's Chris, and today's lecture is going to be about cultures, communities, and globalization. So just a quick introduction about the organization. Socratic Med is a grassroots nonprofit, and it provides sensible solutions to students with disparate medical school opportunities. So I listed some of our contact information. We have the Instagram handle. Our YouTube page has all of our previous lectures and a bunch of other content there that can help you if you're a pre-med student. Our website, socraticmed.net, is also an awesome resource. We have a GroupMe, which is our main communication with the students that are part of our program currently. And I also at the bottom put a link tree down there because we do personalized office hours with 3 of our MCAT tutors, and you can also find any other links to our other channels on that link tree as well. So if you have a minute and you're interested in any of these, please take a look at them. There are some pretty important links. And then just a little bit about me really quickly. My name is Chris. I graduated from Stony Brook University in May of 2019. I finished a pre-medical track and I had a bachelor's in applied mathematics and statistics. I took the MCAT last April and I scored a 520. And I got a perfect score on the psych and sociology section. So that's why my tutoring specialties are in biology, psychology, and sociology. Okay, so we're just going to dive right in. The first subtopic of today's lecture will be about human culture. So we're just going to talk a little bit about culture and how you might see it on the MCAT. So starting with the basics, what is culture? Well, culture is the shared beliefs, values, practices, and knowledge of a specific social group. I know throughout high school, I was always getting the definition that culture is the blueprints for a society. So it really is what makes a specific society that society, what is important about it, what's interesting about it. And there are different types of culture. When we analyze culture, we can split it up into a bunch of different ways. So symbolic culture is the facet that is made up of symbols, and it's recognized by members of that culture. So it's not material. So symbolic culture can involve greetings, gestures, languages, rituals, anything like that. Like if you travel across the world, obviously a different country is going to greet, it's going to greet acquaintances differently than you would maybe in this country, or even within a specific culture, you're going to greet an acquaintance differently than you're going to greet a longtime friend or a parent or something like that. So it's the not material things that we do, the way we interact with each other, that makes up our symbolic culture. And opposed to that, we have material culture as well. That is the facet of culture that is made up of actual physical objects. So examples here, material culture is made up of food, clothing, hairstyles, and this is the most obvious form of culture, I think, that we think of. For example, when we travel on vacation, we say we like to soak in the culture. And what we usually mean by that is we like to travel, we look at the sites, we like to see the historic sites. We'll eat at restaurants there. Maybe we'll buy some clothes over there. So a lot of times, especially when we're talking, from an American viewpoint, when we talk about culture and consuming the culture of others, a lot of times we're talking about material culture, but it's very important to make that distinction. And then we have non-material culture, and that's just the beliefs and thought processes shared by a people or a social group. So when you change groups, if you're in America, you're going to have a different belief about certain things than if you go to Japan or if you go to the opposite side of the world. It's just the culture and the society that you grow up in. It forms our beliefs and our thoughts, and that's part of the non-material culture aspect. So within a society, culture may vary depending on factors such as class or race. And 2 further divisions of culture that we can analyze and look in real time are high culture and popular culture. So high culture, I'm sure we've heard of both of these, but high culture describes the parts of culture that are consumed by the elite to express their identity. So high culture are the fancy things, basically. So when we're thinking of the very elite or the very upper class, things that are fancy that they use to identify with their socioeconomic status. So when you think of someone rich in America, for example, you would think of, maybe they like to consume art. They'll go to art galas, or they'll spend a lot of time at the ballet, or they'll go to an opera, or they'll eat at very exclusive restaurants, very high-end restaurants. So that's all part of high culture because it's consumed by the elite and it helps them to express their identity. And similarly, we also have popular culture or pop culture, which describes the elements that appeal to the majority of a social group. And they're often communicated through social media and mass media like radio and television. And pop culture is something that all of us are familiar with. And like the definition says, it's consumed by the mass majority, by the majority of the population. So anybody that's on social media, anybody that watches TV, you know, you're very much in tune to what's going on, even if it's not super important things, you know, like something political or something that's going on with the weather, even if it's just the life of a celebrity or something, you know, something like that, that maybe one person finds value in and another person doesn't. It's all part of pop culture because it's consumed by the masses. So while culture varies from group to group, there are also universals, and these are patterns and traits that are shared by all human beings. We've developed and grown for thousands of years, separate, isolated from each other. But there are universals that we share. There are not a lot of them, but they are. And it's usually pertaining to meeting basic needs. So like gathering food, if we're building shelter, you know, manipulating water, bringing irrigation, bringing water. Stuff like that are universals because those are things that it's part of human culture, that it's a uniting factor. We all need to do this stuff to survive. But everything else, I mean, everything else is really cultural aspects that develop specifically to, you know, a people's culture. So that's why cultural differences are actually much more common than cultural universals, which is interesting and definitely something to keep in mind. So beliefs and values. So our values and beliefs are some of the most crucial aspects of a culture. So they make up that non-material culture that we were speaking about before. They're very similar, values and beliefs, but there are some differences. They're connected, but they are different. So values are defined as a culture's standard for evaluating what is good or bad. This affects our behavior and our character. So an example is that some cultures may value monogamy over sexual promiscuity. I know very conservative or very religious cultures value monogamy over sexual promiscuity, and that would be considered a value. And we'll talk in a minute about how beliefs affect these values, but that would be that specific value. Some societies may use laws to enforce the values as well. So values are sort of like the ideal way that we want people to act, and it's not always the way that humans do act. So for example, in America, we have anti-discrimination laws. And that enforces the value of open-mindedness because we are said to value diversity, open-mindedness, but that's not always the case. You know, we have our prejudices, we have our biases. So we have anti-discrimination laws in America. And it, among doing other things, it enforces this value of open-mindedness and it discourages behaviors that are counter to it. And it discourages it by penalizing it. And beliefs are the convictions or principles held by people that affect which values they hold. So it's somewhat of a cause and effect relationship. They're definitely intertwined. So the belief that you hold will lead to a value. So a belief in Christianity may result in one's held value of monogamy, if that makes sense. So a lot of times beliefs are what's going on in our head, and then the values are the standards that we set, the way that we are supposed to act, the ideal way that we are supposed to act. And then we have norms. Those are just the rules of social conduct within a society. We talked a little bit before about greetings. I thought that was a pretty good example. Acquaintances in the United States meeting for the first time may shake hands as a greeting. That's not the case all over the world. Each society is going to have, you know, a different norm of how to conduct themselves in a specific social situation. And that's part of the cultural differences from social group to social group. And sometimes, obviously, it makes for a breakdown in communication between two individuals from two different social groups. Okay, so subcultures and countercultures. These are also both similar. I see these get confused a lot of the times, but there are some pretty important differences between the two. So they're both smaller sections of a culture that have slightly different values, but they're a little bit different from each other. So a subculture is a smaller group of people within a culture who share slightly different values and beliefs than the masses. So the key there is that they share slightly different values. These groups normally hold values that are somewhat in line with those of the masses. So they're not standing completely at odds with the masses. They just have, their values are slightly different. And a lot of times it's marginalized communities that are trying to, integrate into mainstream and, establish boundaries and respect. So examples include bikers, bodybuilders, the LGBTQ plus community, anything like that. Those are considered subcultures. And you can look into them, and they actually do have their, they have their own ways of dressing, their own ways of speaking. So it's really interesting when you look individually into each of those. But those are the subcultures. They're not the important part. The important thing to understand about a subculture is that it's not standing at odds with the mass, as opposed to a counterculture. It is also a small group of people within a culture, but they are counter, like the name. They're standing at odds with the larger group's beliefs and values. So they are trying to change something usually. And they usually start as protests or attempts to change the society. And they're actually often eventually adopted into the society's mainstream culture. And a few examples of countercultures in America were the suffragettes, polygamists. You could even consider the abolitionists as counterculture. And a lot of times they're fighting against, they're protesting, and it does sort of become, it starts to become part of the mainstream culture, the counterculture. So subculture is sort of like an offshoot of culture. Counterculture is against it. So definitely keep those two in mind, and definitely make sure you understand the difference between the two. Okay, and a little bit about the spread of culture. So cultural diffusion is the transfer of elements of culture from one social group to another. So cultural diffusion often occurs voluntarily through contact of different cultures, but it can also be forced. For example, cultural imperialism. I think there are a lot of people who will probably debate the use of the phrase cultural imperialism as a section of cultural diffusion. But I mean, if we consider it as a forced form of cultural diffusion, that kind of is what it is. The diffusion of culture has been accelerated in recent years due to the rise of mass media and global communication. So we'll talk a little bit about globalization as well later, but mass media, global communication, and technology within the last 100 years or so, from mostly the 20th and 21st century, have caused this huge exponential increase in globalization and the diffusion of culture all across the globe. I mean, if you walk down the street, regardless of what country you're in, if you walk down the street in specific areas, you can probably find restaurants in different places from all different countries. And cultural diffusion may lead to cultural competence and an increased understanding of different cultures, which is something that we value in America and something that we want. Cultural competence is important in easing the disparities in the American healthcare system, for example. There are a lot of disparities in the American healthcare system, and a lot of times this sort of cultural boundaries present some issues for certain individuals to seek health in America, to seek healthcare in America, excuse me. So if we can increase our cultural competence in this understanding of different cultures, how they get sick, why they're getting sick, what would urge a specific individual from a specific culture to seek help, understanding the language, reducing language barriers. All of this is cultural competence that contributes to decreasing these disparities that we see in the current healthcare system. So cultural diffusion and cultural competence are really important to understand, and they're just important for health in general. So cultural transmission refers to the process of spreading cultural information across generations. So from parents to children, for example. And I think one of the most obvious examples of this are the school systems. They play a very large role in the transmission of cultural information to the younger generation. Okay. So cultural lag occurs when material culture changes faster than non-material culture. This is often a result of technological advances, and we see it in a bunch of different places. We see it on social media. There are just constantly new platforms that are rising, and there are a lot of ethical and moral questions that arise as well. And one of the examples in medicine is the rise of genetic engineering. So the technology of genetic engineering would be considered material culture for whichever culture has discovered it. So in I guess globally at this point, genetic engineering has progressed much more quickly than society's acceptance of it. So there are ongoing moral and ethical debates about the use of genetic engineering, what its limits are, what we should use it for, what we shouldn't use it for. So we have this material culture, this actual technology that's developed, but we're not really sure how we're supposed to use it. And we haven't really come to a consensus about that. So that's what cultural lag is. It's when the material aspect of something is ahead of the non-material development of that same thing. And that causes, it causes some friction in society, it causes debate, disagreement. Another interesting aspect, so when an individual experiences disorientation as a result of being subjected to alternative cultures, and this is often through travel or relocation, they are said to be experiencing culture shock. So this disorientation may be extremely challenging for an individual trying to acclimate to these new changes. So you could think of someone maybe moving to a new country, or even maybe say a high school student who just graduated and is moving very, very far away to a completely different region of their country, or maybe even a different country. They're going to be on their own for the first time. They have to cook, clean, go out, get food. And on top of all of that, if they're moving to someplace that's really geographically separated from, from their own original location, the food is going to be different. The people are going to be different. The way they speak is different. Their attitudes towards different things might be different. So sometimes all of that conglomerate of different culture basically is what contributes to this feeling of culture shock, which is just that disorientation. And it could be very disheartening sometimes, and it could be very hard to adapt to the new culture. And interestingly, once an individual is accustomed to this new environment, they may experience what is called reverse culture shock when they return home. So that's basically the exact same thing, obviously in reverse. Once you get acclimated to that new environment and you go back to your own place, you return to your own home location, you may experience reverse culture shock because now you're so used to where you're living now. Okay, so more cultural interactions. So when those from different cultures mix with each other, there are many different outcomes, and we're going to discuss three of them, the three major ones that are on the MCAT. So make sure you know these three. You should definitely know them by name and definition. So assimilation is the one that we've heard of the most. It's probably the most mainstream. It is the process by which an individual forsakes aspects of his or her current culture to adopt those of a different culture. And assimilation was had a much more positive connotation maybe in the 19th and 20th century. But now in the 21st century, we're sort of valuing multiculturalism a lot more, basically because of that cultural competence that we were talking about a few minutes ago. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing to introduce elements of different cultures, because diversity is what gives us, a different outlook on maybe a situation that we've been looking at one way for years and years. We have new ways to look at it. So someone moving to a new country may give up the dressings of his or her old culture and adopt a style more in line with the new culture. So maybe someone who is moving from a sub-Saharan African country moves to America. If they change their traditional clothing and they adopt a more Western style, that would be considered, assimilation. So another is amalgamation, and that occurs when two cultures blend with each other to create a new culture different from any of the original cultures. And there are a lot of examples of amalgamation in America, especially down south. If you go to like the Cajun areas or Tex-Mex areas down there, it's like American and Mexican cuisines have been, and even aspects of French cuisine. It's like fusion. We use the word fusion in our day-to-day lives. That's what amalgamation really is. It's these cultures that are blending together to create a new culture, new aspects, new elements that were different from the original cultures. Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting one too. And then we have multiculturalism or pluralism, and that occurs when multiple cultures exist side by side in a society. And I did mention that a little while ago. It's existing side by side, but not blending too much. So for example, if you're in New York, you go to Manhattan or you go to Queens and you walk down a block, you'll see a pizzeria, a Thai food place, a Mexican place, pretty much anything you can think of all on the same block. Anything, any type of food you could think of is all going to be on the same block. And that's a really good example of multiculturalism. It's multiple cultures existing side by side. Okay, so review time. You can pause the video. You can take a minute if you want to read this over. You can pause the video because I will show you guys the answer in about 5 seconds. So which of the following is not an example of material culture? So if you want to read these, pause it. Go right ahead. Okay, so which of the following is not an example of material culture? The answer is B, singing. So again, remember, material culture is just physical. So clothing is definitely an example of material culture. What we wear is a huge indicator of where we're from. C, housing structures, the types of houses that we live in, the types of shelters that we live in is also an example of material culture. A housing structure in America is going to be very different from, maybe very different from, say, some sort of housing structure in Tibet, for example. And cell phones as well. Cell phones vary. Some countries may have lower rates of cell phone ownership. Some may have higher rates. The types of cell phones, the models, what they do, they're all going to vary from culture to culture. So as you travel, you can actually physically see the change in culture. And that's really the indicator of material culture. So the only one that is not material is singing, B, because it's not physical. It would be an art. It would be part of non-material culture. Okay, so race, immigration, and globalization. So a little bit about race and ethnicity. Although the two concepts are related, they do have important distinctions. So race, ethnicity, and nationality are three very confusing topics for a lot of people. And I think you should definitely understand the difference between the three. You should very clearly have a clear-cut understanding and definition of what the three are, why they're different, how we categorize them and how we use them and how they affect an individual's day-to-day life. So race is a social categorization created based upon biological traits or inherited differences. These manifest as physical appearances. So humans categorize people based on these biological or inherited differences, but it's very important to understand that these are social constructs. So it is the human categorization that creates the category of race, or even the category of ethnicity or nationality for that matter. So while race, the categorization is based on biological traits, it's very important to understand that this is just a social construct. So the US Census Bureau currently divides race in America into 6 categories, which, again, it's just a bureau that is arbitrarily dividing the country into races that they see are most helpful for us to analyze. There's nothing in nature that says these are the races. It is a social construct that is completely made up by humans. But the US Census Bureau divides race in America into 6 categories. So we have Black, African American, white, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and other. And a lot of this is up to the individual and how they feel they identify with their race, because as we know, it's not just a black and white thing. Okay, so ethnicity is a categorization based on shared culture rather than biological and inherited traits. So ethnicity, for example, would be sort of your background. So maybe where your family comes from. A lot of times people identify their ethnicity with a geographic location, not necessarily a nation of today, but maybe a nation from the past or a specific location on a continent. And so it's not always the same thing. So if you are an African American, your ethnicity may be Egyptian, for example, or Nubian. So if you're from Egypt, your race may be Black, your nationality would be Egyptian, but if you identify as Nubian, that would be your ethnicity, because it's sort of like this subgroup that has their own culture. It's another way for us to identify with the group. So ethnicity is not to be confused with nationality, which indicates an individual's citizenship status. So another example, probably a better example, is someone with an American nationality may further identify as Cherokee. So their nationality would be considered American, and their ethnicity, they may identify as Cherokee because they're part of like a Cherokee tribe. And we could go even further and say that they would have a different race. I mean, they would most likely identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. But again, it's really up to how the individual identifies and how they feel that these identities describe who they are. Okay, so prejudices and actions that systemically discriminate based on race is known as racism. So the definitions of race and ethnicity have been subject to much debate, and because of that, the specific definition of racism is also often debated. For these reasons, racism is sometimes used to refer to discrimination against ethnic and other cultural groups as well. One of the main things that people really do agree on, I guess right now, the definition of racism is that it's a system. It's systemic oppression of a specific group, usually a race, but it can sometimes apply to ethnicity or other social or cultural groups as well. But the main key is that it's a system, it's systemic discrimination. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk about migration. Migration is the geographical movement of an individual or group as opposed to other forms of geographical movement. Migration, both voluntary and involuntary, is a form of permanent movement. So when we're talking about migration, we are talking about picking up your life and moving to a different place. And it's important, again, to keep in mind that migration is just one of the natural human states. We humans have been, for tens of thousands of years, we have been roaming the earth, we've been fleeing natural disasters, we've been following food. So we've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. Regardless of, invisible political boundaries or country, city states. So again, migration, we can stratify migration and we can look at it from different perspectives and we can group it differently. So there are a bunch of different definitions on this slide and the next one. So again, make sure you're just familiar with all of these. So external migration refers to migration to another nation. So that would be like moving to another country. If you are moving from Canada to the United States, you would be considered an external migrant. Internal migration refers to migration within a nation's border. If you're moving from New York to California, you're an internal migrant. Voluntary, and it's probably, I guess it's pretty obvious to note, but internal migration tends to be more legally and politically easier than external migration. Voluntary migration is a general form of migration that results from personal decision, which are internal factors. Personal decision is just another phrase for internal factors. So external and internal migration can be either voluntary or involuntary. So a lot of these definitions, they're not mutually exclusive definitions. Some of them overlap with each other. So yeah, so involuntary migration, like I just said, is a general form of migration that is forced from external factors, usually threats from the environment, and that's like famine or ethnic cleansing. So refugees are a form of involuntary migrants. External factors as opposed to internal factors are things that are forcing the migrant from their environment, forcing them out and forcing them to move somewhere else. So most of these terms are pretty self-explanatory when you look at them. You don't really even have to spend too much time on the definition because their definition really is in the name. Actually, okay. And I just wanted to point out that I put a little diagram at the bottom. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely take a look. It's just the annual net migration rate from 2015 to 2020. So we're going to continue a little bit with the types of migration. So we have settlers. These are those who migrate to unsettled areas for the first time. So that's important because it's a little bit different than colonization, which we'll talk about in a minute. The key there is that they're unsettled areas. They're settling, they're kind of like pioneers, they're settling for the first time. And that is considered a form of migration. So refugees move to settled areas because of displacement from their initial area. And that is also, hotly debated in the political arena, how to handle refugees. Is it moral to deny refugees if they need to come in? But refugees are displaced by force. They are involuntarily pushed out of their original home. And they, seek home in settled areas. So colonization is a complicated phenomenon in which a people migrate to an already settled area, specifically to exert cultural dominance over the new location. So again, colonization, just like cultural imperialism, you can make an argument that maybe it shouldn't really be considered a type of migration because it's completely involuntary and it is a lot more complicated, and it involves a lot more than just the migrant moving over. But for the MCAT, for purposes for the MCAT, we can just consider it a type of migration and just say, make sure that we specify that it is specifically to exert cultural dominance over the people of the new location. And there are tons and tons of examples throughout history that I'm sure we have all learned about colonization at one point or another. So immigration specifically refers to the movement of migrants into a new area, legally or illegally. And emigration refers to the exit of migrants from the initial area. So migration is just the general phrase for movement. Immigration is the verb that we use to describe the movement into a new area, and emigration is what we use to describe the exit of migrants. And you can see that I sort of underline the E under emigration. Emigration is exiting. So you can remember that we emigrate from a place, but we immigrate to a place. And you can even remember that immigration into a new area. So just small semantic differences, but it doesn't hurt to help. It doesn't hurt to know. Okay, a little bit more on migration. There are many reasons and theories that aim to explain human migration. So Everett Lee theorized that migration was driven by a set of push and pull factors imposed upon an individual group from the initial and final location. So basically, there were two main reasons why people are leaving. It's because they want to leave the place they're at, and they want to go to their destination. So the push factors are the aspects of the initial location that are undesirable and contribute to a migrant's decision to leave. Push factors are usually economic, political, or religious. So if you're in an area that hits an economic depression, or an area that's in political turmoil, if you're facing religious persecution, these are all very strong push factors that would influence an individual's decision to leave their home. On top of the push factors, you also have pull factors acting upon these individuals. And these are the attractive qualities of the target destination that pull a migrant to the final location. So if you have all of these push factors, say we're talking about, maybe Southern Italy in the mid 20th centuries, there were push factors. It was very economic and political factors were pushing them out of Italy because it just was not the greatest place to be. A lot of them are moving to the United States because these pull factors, there were so many opportunities. There were economic opportunities, there was religious and political freedom, that they thought, or that they were told upon coming here. So those are the attractive qualities of the target destination that pull them to the final location. And yes, like I said, these are the positive opportunities. So we're being pushed away from the original location and we're being pulled towards the final location. So that's basically Lee's theories of push and pull factors on migration. And it does do a pretty good job of explaining why we immigrate, why we leave, and why we go to where we're going. Okay, globalization. So globalization is the process by which political, cultural, and economic interests merge into a single world market. And that's happening more and more every day, as I'm sure you're all aware. Global trade is a human behavior that has been observed for thousands of years. Many ancient civilizations although limited, they would contact other civilizations for trade. So we can go as far back to ancient Greece or ancient Egypt. Before we even had mass media, there were still varying degrees of globalization, of global trade at that time. It didn't really happen until the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. It brought about a boom in globalization due to cheap mass production of materials, and also the technological advances in communication during World War II and the Cold War triggered the exponential process of globalization we're currently experiencing. So the rise of TV, the rise of radio, even more recently, internet and social media, we are more connected to each other than ever. You can open up your phone, log on to Instagram, and a business from a country across the world is trying to sell you shoes, for example. So we are living in an extremely global economy, and the globalization is just going to continue just because of these technological advances that we have accomplished in the 20th and early 21st centuries. So I put that picture to the left because I think most people watching this video being born into a global world, we tend to take for granted or tend to not really notice just how global it is. Most of the products that we use, a lot of the products are international corporations, and a lot of them are not even based in the country that we're living in. And that really wouldn't be possible without globalization. So it's just a different world that we're living in now than even compared to 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, and definitely a couple of thousand years ago. So proponents of globalization may point to the opening of new markets as an opportunity to increase wealth. So if you have a company in a country, your markets are finite and eventually it's going to run out. But I mean, if the economy becomes increasingly global, you're going to open new markets and you're going to have more places to sell your product. I mean, on the other hand, though, opponents of globalization are going to cite the corruption of wealthy nations and exploitation of resource-rich, lower-income nations as one of the major problems. And that definitely does happen, and we do see that. So furthermore, there are cultural, political, and environmental drawbacks that arise out of this exploitation. So, for example, these multinational corporations will outsource dirty jobs to developing countries and lower-income countries, and that contributes to sort of the environmental decline and even the economic dependence of these lower income countries on these more wealthy countries. And it is a form of exploitation and lending as well. There are certain banks and certain international corporations that will lend expensive loans to lower income countries, and they can't necessarily pay them back. So globalization does not come without exploitation. Okay, so we're going to do another review. Which of the following is true of refugees? So take maybe a minute, read over these, pause the video because in a couple of seconds I'll reveal to you guys the answer. Okay, so the answer is B. They experience strong push factors. So remember what refugees are. They are displaced from their location, usually because of political, economic, or religious reasons. So A says they are voluntary migrants, and that is not true. They are being displaced. They are being forced out of their homes, so they are not voluntary. They are never external migrants. That's also not true. A lot of times they are external migrants. Refugees from countries will often leave their country to find others. And they are not involuntary migrants, which is not true. The wording is a little bit tricky because we have a negative over there, but not involuntary means they are voluntary, which basically is saying the same thing as A. So both of those are false. B, they experience strong push factors, which is definitely true, because remember, push factors are those political, religious, economic factors that are pushing us out of our home location. And that's really the hallmark of a refugee, is that these push factors are so strong that these refugees cannot stay where they are. They have to leave without decision. They have to leave because of how strong these push factors are. So B would be the correct answer for this. Okay. And then we're just going to talk really quickly about urbanization and inequality. Okay, so there are a lot of words and a lot of definitions and a lot of terms to know on the next couple of slides. So a lot of them are just straight definitions, and I think that's probably the best way for you to study for this, because if you understand the definitions of these specific terms, more so on the next couple of slides, then it will definitely help you understand all of these concepts. So urbanization refers to the growth of urban areas due to the relocation of people from rural areas to cities. And this is a result of global change. It's also a result of industrialization, which often precedes urbanization. So as advances in technology and increased need for workers, as those needs increase, it draws individuals to the cities from rural locations. So that's what urbanization is. We're going from a rural location to an urban location. And it's usually because of industrialization. We have these advances in technology, jobs are increasing in the urban area. And it also, urbanization can also be, the effect of a decrease in agriculture, or a decrease in the emphasis of agriculture in a specific society. So in the US, urbanization rate is about 80%. And we measure urbanization rate, including urban and suburban areas. So it's basically how much of the population is not living in a rural area is really what the urbanization rate means. So in the US, it's about 80%, which is pretty high compared to the rest of the world. The world average is about 50%. So that's about 1 in every 2 people living across the entire world will live in either an urban area or a suburb. And like I said before, as countries' emphasis on agriculture decreases, many individuals leave these rural areas in search of more social services. This is known as rural flight. So that basically, many people will live in these rural areas because they're depending on agriculture. So if they're sustaining themselves or if they're selling the agriculture, they're selling their crops, that's how they make a living. But because of urbanization, there are more jobs, possibly easier, possibly higher paying, that may open up in the city. So they're going to leave. A lot of people are going to leave from these rural areas. And as these rural areas become even less populated, even more sparsely populated, their social services as well are going to decline. So social services mean schools. There might be school closures, and the most local school for your kids is going to be 3-4 miles away. Same thing with hospitals, same thing with doctors' offices. As people move away, social services move away as well. And that's what we call rural flight. So a lot of times people will leave these rural areas because other people are leaving, specifically because there are no more social services in these areas. And then they move, to urban and suburban areas, and they can find those services more easily. So suburbanization, as opposed to urbanization, refers to the movement of people from urban areas to suburban areas. So first we talked about urbanization. We had people moving from rural areas to urban areas, and now we're talking about suburbanization, which is the next step. People move from urban areas to suburbs. So a suburb is a community located outside of a city that is less densely populated than a city, but it's more populated than the rural areas around it. And the suburbs are usually connected to the city. A lot of the inhabitants of suburbs will maintain their jobs in the city, in the actual urban area, but live in the suburb. And it's usually a result of increased wealth. So urban sprawl occurs when the population of urban areas declines because of movement to more remote locations, like these suburbs. They may start as rural areas, but as more people move over, they become suburbs. And this urban sprawl, this moving of urban areas, the spreading out of people from urban areas, also may lead to what we call urban blight, which is sort of the opposite of gentrification, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. But urban blight is a phenomenon in which less functioning areas of large cities degrade as a result of urban decline. So as people in wealth leave these areas, they're going to become desolate, dangerous, and they may experience a decrease in social amenities and opportunities. So it's very similar to rural flight, urban blight. When people leave the areas, these social amenities and these opportunities are going to leave as well. So maybe the poverty rate might increase, the crime rate is going to go up a little bit as well. And that's what happens, that's a result of urban sprawl. On the other hand, we have gentrification, and that's a process of urban renewal. So it's basically the exact opposite of urban blight. And that's the renewal in which wealthy residents return to a city to restore the existing infrastructure. And this is happening all over the country, especially because a lot of people who maybe have come from wealthy families who are not making as much money as their families are moving to these locations. They still have more money than the locals, but they feel the economic need to move to these locations, and they cause this gentrification, which has its positives and its negatives, which we'll talk about. So gentrification may change the economic and demographic layout of the city, and there are both positive and negative effects, like I just said. There may be an increase in the tax base, so maybe it becomes a more wealthy area. The price of land goes up there, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it may drive out locals who have lived there for years. So people who are living there, who have been living there their entire lives, who don't make too much money, when the taxes go up, they don't have enough money and they have to leave their homes because of this gentrification. So there are definitely arguments to be made for both sides of gentrification. and a little bit about inequality and segregation. There are many different types of inequality and segregation, but right now we're just going to really quickly focus on spatial inequality and residential segregation. And I put that little map over there to the right. It just shows America. It groups them by regions, and it's color coded. Yellow is low segregation, residential. Orange is high, and red is very extreme areas of residential segregation. So you can see a lot of the coastal areas, they experience higher levels of segregation, of residential segregation. So spatial inequality occurs when individuals who are geographically grouped by socioeconomic status do not receive access to the same resources. So these resources may be environmental, like clean water, or services like medical care and education. And that can even be tied to that sort of rural flight that we were talking about. When they leave rural areas, schools close, hospitals close, and that contributes to spatial inequality. So the people that are living there do not have access to the same resources as do people, say, who could afford to live in the city and have everything at the tips of their fingers. They can walk down the block and hit a hospital. So spatial inequality is definitely a big issue. And residential segregation also, it's the separation of groups into different neighborhoods by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Okay, so this is a list. I will go over all of them. These are some important definitions when we're talking about social mobility and inequality. You should definitely know them and understand them for the MCAT. You should be able to identify them. So meritocracy is a stratification system based on personal effort. Stratification is, just the way sort of caste system in socioeconomic gradient in a country. So in a meritocracy, the system is based on personal effort or merit to establish a social standing. And it's important to note that no society solely stratifies based on effort. It's meritocracy is sort of like an ideal system, but there's really no society that is just going to, put you in a socioeconomic class based on your effort. Social mobility is the ability to move up or down within a social stratification system. Upward mobility obviously indicates an increase in social class. So if upward mobility is possible, we like to believe that upward mobility is possible. And in a lot of cases it is. But I think it's probably exaggerated to certain extents for multiple reasons. Downward mobility indicates a decrease in social class. I think you could argue that downward mobility is a lot easier than upward mobility. Intergenerational mobility indicates a change in social class between parents and children within the same family. So say we have a blue collar working class parent, say the father is a plumber and the mother doesn't work. And they have a child who becomes an extremely wealthy neurosurgeon. That would be an example of intergenerational mobility. Intragenerational mobility describes the difference in social class between members of the same generation. So say we have that same kid who is a neurosurgeon and his brother is an electrician, or his cousin is maybe a trade worker, or maybe is unemployed for a very long time, or for whatever reason does not belong to the same social class as a member of the same generation. That is intragenerational mobility. So social reproduction refers to the structures in a society that transmit and reinforce social inequality across generations. Education, for example, unequal access to education. If you don't have money and you live in a less wealthy area that does not have access to good education, that affects your children. If they don't get a good education, then it's going to be much more difficult for them as an adult to attain that upward mobility. And that's what social reproduction is. It's the passing of this social inequality, and it's the structures in society that passes these social inequalities to the generation. So it's sort of like that cycle that needs to be broken. Class consciousness and false consciousness. So class consciousness is the set of beliefs a person holds regarding their socioeconomic status. So we all have, to a degree of class consciousness. We know who we are, we know where we stand. And that's all that is. It's just the set of beliefs that you hold regarding it. How, who I'm supposed to interact with, what I'm supposed to eat, what I'm supposed to wear, what I'm supposed to do, what job I'm supposed to have. And that class consciousness is what you believe, the set of beliefs that a person holds regarding their own socioeconomic status. Whereas false consciousness is the inability of people to recognize the inequality and exploitation of their class because of prevalent views and beliefs that legitimize the class system. So maybe there's an essential worker that is making minimum wage, and it is not a living wage, and they are being told that they're not being paid a minimum wage because they're not doing work that is worth a minimum wage. You will have millions and millions of people who will agree with that statement. And some people might argue that that is an example of false consciousness, because it is a belief that contributes to the inequality and exploitation of the working class. And it's because there are prevalent views and beliefs that legitimize that class system. So you may have people that have much higher paying jobs and that are in higher social classes that are saying, I don't think you should be paid for doing this. I don't think you should get a living wage for doing that, because that's how it is. That's how it's always been. And that contributes to this false consciousness because it's just the general belief, and it's just part of the culture. Okay, we are almost done, and I just wanted to really quickly mention the socioeconomic gradient in health, because of course it does affect healthcare. In the US, there is a huge disparity in healthcare based on socioeconomic status, and one of the reasons, not the entire reason, but one of the reasons is because healthcare must be bought in the US like other products. So an individual's wealth and socioeconomic status is going to directly affect their personal health and hygiene. So when someone is sick, if they do not have money in America, if they do not have health insurance, they do not have money, they are much less likely to seek treatment for it. So it's pretty intuitive that the lower your socioeconomic status is, the less likely you're going to seek treatment, the less likely you're going to have access to adequate treatment. And all of this contributes to the socioeconomic gradient. And not only does it take into account an individual's ability to pay directly for healthcare, but it also takes into account their type of job, their access to food, environmental factors, and all of this affects your health. So we don't just have to think about access to a doctor's office or access to a hospital, but I mean, there are dirty jobs. There are types of jobs that are, dangerous. So people of a lower socioeconomic status, for example, maybe they're a coal worker or they work in the coal mines. Those jobs can be very dangerous, and there are, health consequences, respiratory issues that these people have, and it's because of the socioeconomic gradient. Access to food is another one. Organic food, quality food is extremely expensive. If you need 500 calories for a meal and you want to buy really healthy food, fruits, vegetables, salad, it's going to cost you $40, $50. Whereas you can go, if you only have $4 or $5 to spend on a meal, you can go down to the local McDonald's and you can get all of your calories in a really fatty processed hamburger. So access to food is another big one, and environmental factors as well. There are higher rates of pollution in communities that are of lower socioeconomic status. So, environmental factors like pollution, also, water pollution, air pollution, that all factors into this gradient, and it all factors into, how an individual's health is affected. So those with higher socioeconomic statuses have better outcomes in healthcare, pretty obvious. And that could be within the same country or across countries. So, I mean, someone with a higher socioeconomic status within the same country will have better outcomes than someone with a lower one in that same country. And we can also take countries as an average. So if we have a more wealthy country, a wealthier country, they're going to have better outcomes than, a less wealthy country. So it's within the country and across countries as well. So the socioeconomic gradient is prevalent across the world. And yep, it affects all healthcare systems, even those with socialized medicine, to varying degrees, of course. But like we did say before, it is not the only issue in the healthcare system. The payment part is not the only issue. It is a large issue, but it is not the only one. And that is just about it. We covered pretty much everything. There's a lot of content in here, so I think it would definitely be worth your while to go back. If you want to maybe watch the video at slower speed, if you want to look at if you want to print out these slides, print them out, study them, make notes. If you want to go back into our other 15-week program and maybe look at both of them, That's a good idea. I put my email here again. Email me if you want to be added to the group me, if you have any questions, any comments, anything, anything about this lecture, anything about anything else that you want to ask me about, feel free to shoot me an email. Other than that, I think we are all finished for today. So have a great rest of your day, everybody, and we will post more videos. We'll post 2 more videos next week.